I've been telling you for years about something I created called the Global Citizen Sandwich. It's where you live in an affordable, pro-freedom place, but you bank somewhere else and you invest somewhere else, and you have the best of all worlds. Today, I'm going to tell you how if you want to move to Europe, you can have the best of all worlds there. A lot of people that we talk to want to actually move to Europe, or they want a golden visa or a citizenship to give them the ability to move to Europe in the future. It more aligns with their values. They believe they'll be more free. Many European countries actually have lower taxes through special regimes than the US or Canada or Australia or the UK. The point of the global citizen sandwich is that you're not going to put all of your eggs into one basket. We don't believe in doing that here. And so you see a lot of people who want to move to Europe, either through actively moving there or through getting a Plan B golden visa or citizenship so they can move there in the future. And what I think people often make the mistake of doing is saying, I want to move to Portugal. So I'm moving my money to Portugal. I'm moving my family to Portugal. I'm going to move my investments to Portugal. That's not the kind of diversification that we preach. That's not going where you're treated best, because the place that you want to live, let's say in Europe, is probably not the best place for those other things. It's not a wealth haven, and it's probably not a booming investment market. Live for living's sake, invest for investing's sake, and store wealth for wealth's sake. That's what the global citizen sandwich is about. I'll quickly recap in Asia, and then we'll get into the challenges of doing the same thing in Europe. In Asia, I live in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. It's the site of Nomad Capitalist Live, our annual event. But to me, it's perhaps the best value destination in the planet. Nice people, great weather, extremely affordable. Real estate is dirt cheap, but the quality of stuff is pretty high. A lot of consumer conveniences, stuff is run well, decent efficiency. I do think Malaysian banks are safe, but Singapore is the gold standard asset haven of the world, and it's right next door. On the other hand, Singaporean stock market, good for dividends, but it's not taken off. Malaysian stock market has been rather languishing over the years. Cambodia, for example, Bangladesh, Vietnam to some extent, those markets are hot. And so you're living in the middle for value. You're getting more freedom in Malaysia than I think you'd get in a wealth haven. You keep your money in the wealth haven and you make the investments in the growing markets. In Europe, it's a little harder. Obviously, you don't really have a clear equivalent of what Bangladesh is in Europe. If you look at the Balkans, for example, we've talked about Serbia and Montenegro. I've been spending time looking at Albania recently. Those markets are more on par with the Malaysia in terms of their development, but probably don't have as much potential because they're smaller countries and they don't really have any alliance. They're not part of the EU. They don't have some big bloc next door with China. And even Serbia, which does business with China, I mean, it's just a small country. It's never going to have the impact that, let's say, a Vietnam with 80 million people does. On the other hand, storing your wealth in Europe is difficult. Let's say even if you move to Ireland, which has a historic, connections with a common travel agreement with the UK private banks don't want you. They don't take any EU tax resident, including Irish tax residents. UK private banks are pretty difficult to get into. Swiss banks, relatively difficult to get into. Easier for things like trust structures, but even then, there aren't that many banks that are interested. Easier to get a Swiss bank, I think, if you already live and you are a taxpayer in Europe. But they are notoriously difficult and notoriously high fees. I found Liechtenstein to be more open. You can open a personal account there, or you can open a trust account there. And around Europe, banking has become more difficult. You've got the Andorras, which are, I would say, a bit more opaque. There's fewer options, certainly, to bank there. You've got places like Jersey, which again, being, the UK being outside the EU, not as interesting for them anymore. You've got the minor asset havens like Malta and Cyprus, which have become much more difficult. And so my suggestion for a global citizen sandwich in Europe is if you want to go to Switzerland or Liechtenstein, you can. You're going to pay more for it. My argument would be, especially with some of the tax incentives that many European countries offer, to go and bank somewhere else entirely. And I think probably the best wealth havens, in my opinion, continue to be in Asia, in Singapore. The challenge is you have to find the right Singaporean bank that wants to take you, knowing you pay taxes in the EU. So that wealth haven part of being someone who's going to move to Europe, in my opinion, is more difficult. if nothing else, because a lot of European and certainly Swiss and Liechtenstein banks don't want Americans. So if you're coming from the US, they're probably going to keep you out. Andorra might take you, but all the banks in Europe are going to be tougher on Americans. Some of them are now tougher on British citizens as well. And if you're coming from a country that's not a country that they serve, let's say they don't serve Canadians, for example, you're going to have to move to Europe and then wait a while and then convince them that you're really planning to stay in Europe for them to open your account. There are banks that will work with you. We have a database called Minerva here, and we store all of our knowledge about everything that we do, including all of our banks. And so when you work with us as a client, we will go through and we can plug in the different criteria that you have for banks or for corporate jurisdictions. There's a human touch required, but we have the raw data of here's which banks take which people, and here's our actual real world experience. If you want to work with us as a client and you want to move to Europe and you want to lower your taxes and you want to set up your own global citizen sandwich, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. But as someone who has spent time in Europe, I never really moved all my money to Europe. There are, smaller banks, let's say in Portugal, for example, where they're trying to be more of that high net worth individual bank. The challenge in Europe, especially if you're coming from the US, is that the bank insurance is actually less. So in European member states, it's 100,000 euros in deposit insurance versus higher amounts in countries like the US. And so you really have to understand and trust the bank that you're putting your money into. And some of those banks that are more open to taking you on as a client are smaller, and there's not as much information readily available about them. I was talking to a bank recently that I work with, and it's a really small bank. I looked at their tier 1 capital ratio. It's through the roof. It's maybe the highest I've ever seen. And yet you still think like, that's a small bank. Should I move all my money there? I don't really feel so good about that. So quite frankly, if I'm living in Europe, I'll tell you where I've been getting more comfortable with is Georgia recently. Georgia is not part of the European Union, and people might laugh at the idea of Georgia. Georgian bank stocks have been on a tear recently. Georgia has been doing really well as a country financially. And I might be more comfortable with that because I know they're going to let me in, even if I'm an American. Even, if I decide I don't want to live in Europe anymore, banking in Liechtenstein could be more tough if you decide to leave Europe in the future. Depending on how much money I had, I might put, a country like a Georgia into the mix. So everyone's different. But to me, the wealth storage in Europe is more difficult because they're so much less open to taking on people with different profiles. For me, if I'm living in Europe, I'm still going to be banking in a place like Singapore, and I'm probably going to distribute my money in different countries around the world, including maybe a smaller account where I live. The problem is most European countries' retail banking is not great. Even in like English-speaking Ireland, fees, service is pretty basic, not many perks, not a place you want to be storing your wealth. Even the private banking option at 3 million euros doesn't compare to what you could get for, $1 million or $2 million in one of the better banks in Singapore, or even less than that in a trust bank in Switzerland, for example. So let's talk about the middle part of the sandwich. Where do you want to live? The good news is there's many tax-friendly places in Europe. So if you speak English, tax-friendly Ireland, you can work towards a passport in 5 years. Best tax to passport ratio possibly anywhere in the world because you can pay very, very little tax to the non-dom program compared to your income. You're still paying enough to where you feel like part of society, but you're getting one of the best passports in the world, according to our Nomad Passport Index, including access to about 30 countries, including the UK, once you have it. You can live in any of those places. And so you can do that with the non-dom program and pay relatively little. One place that I like a lot, and I think perhaps these days is underrated, is Greece. I like the architecture, I like the vibe, I like the service. It's where I go in the summers these days. And they have a lump sum tax program. You're going to pay 100,000 euros a year if you buy a property. And you can do that for well over a decade. Same thing in Italy. Their lump sum tax program has increased. I was talking to a neighbor of mine the other day. He's got a very wealthy friend moving to Italy, 200,000 euro lump sum tax for yourself. I said he should have moved a couple of years ago. He said, yeah, it doubled. So Italy's now more expensive, but you don't have to buy property. Those are 3 countries that I like a lot. Portugal used to be less tax friendly. I think Portugal became this kind of panacea in Europe for a lot of folks. It was never the most tax friendly place because of some of the what I call the Swiss cheese of European tax incentives, where People like me who run businesses overseas would have to move their businesses to less friendly locations to take advantage of Portugal's tax deal. Portugal no longer has that tax deal. Where else has tax deals, though? Malta, Cyprus, also English speaking. And so they have non-dom programs, a bit more flexible than Ireland's non-dom program, especially if you're into Bitcoin or crypto. Cyprus has potentially, depending on if you can structure your business in a certain way, a 3-year path to citizenship. Malta, unlikely to grant citizenship in the 5 years that they promise. I've been told it's closer to 18. But you've got a number of different tax-friendly options, and this is not to include the very small places like Jersey, Guernsey, Gibraltar. Andorra is not quite as tax-friendly, but relatively tax-friendly. You've got lots of options for taxes. This is the one thing that people get wrong. They think Europe is a great wealth haven open to all. It's not. And they think Europe is high taxes everywhere, and there's no way to escape that. It's not. There are a handful of countries in Europe, Ireland and Greece being among them, that if you earn a really good income, you will pay less tax living there than you would in Dubai. And again, if you want to work towards citizenship in Ireland or Cyprus, even if you pay Dubai level 9% taxes and you get a passport in 3 or 5 years, pretty good deal. Now, the investment part is the hard part. Certainly this year, European stocks have been doing much better than U.S. stocks. But when I say investment, I mean a macro picture, not just a moment in the stock market. Certainly, you can look at some of the things like, a stock like Rheinmetall in Germany just went through the absolute roof based on, hey, Europe is going to have to deal with its own defense now. That perhaps is a trend that you could look at, but that's not investing in a specific country. The first thing that, if you move to Europe, you're going to have less to invest because compared to a Kuala Lumpur, your property is going to cost so much more. Even in historically, budget-friendly cities like a Warsaw or a Belgrade or a Lisbon, property is really expensive. So you're going to be investing more if you're going to buy your own home into that home and into having a nice lifestyle. You'll have less money left over to invest. When I look around Europe, I just look at it as this stereotypically highly regulated place that's not as growth friendly. I look at it as an entrepreneur where one of the few things about me, hopefully that's still American, is I believe in that, hard work, get after it mentality, which is somewhat at odds with a lot of Western Europe, and that's fine. It's a great place to live. I have been most successful investing in places in the Caucasus, for example, like in Georgia. I've told you about that. I think if you find the right opportunities, Turkey, we can debate. People like to call that Europe. People don't like to call that Europe, but certainly Istanbul and West is geographically in Europe. I think that they've really come onto the scene in a way that a lot of people haven't noticed in certain manufacturing, for example, regional, export. I think that there's a limited number of opportunities there. To the extent that you consider Georgia part of Eastern Europe, as they would consider it, banks, conglomerates, industrials have done very well as just simply investing in property. You probably missed a lot of the property appreciation. I remember showing people stuff that's gone up 4 to 5 times in value over the last, 8, 9, 10 years. But that might be a region that I still think has some potential. Agriculture, another area for the right person. The challenge in Europe is great place to live, great place to reduce your taxes, great place to get a passport. Storing your wealth or making investments, it's just not nearly as good as, let's say, I think Asia is the undisputed leader in that because you've got, all different 3 categories in Asia. To some extent, you have it in Latin America. I would say you largely have it even in Africa. Europe is the one part of the world, ex-US, where I would just live there for living's purposes, enjoy the low taxes, enjoy the lifestyle, buy a beautiful home, and I might keep most of my money somewhere else. You want to be distributed. Treat each place for what it's best at. And most places that are good for living are probably only good for living. If you want to work with us to help figure out your own global citizen sandwich, we put everything under one roof. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. We ask our clients to have $1 million in liquid assets because lowering your taxes, particularly in Europe, is not the cheapest thing to do. Getting residence permits requires money, may require an investment. We help people, though, solve every problem. But we're going to help you solve your problems from A to Z, from lowering your taxes to protecting your assets to having more personal freedom and a plan B. Go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. Join thousands of happy clients in getting your bespoke plan.